committee members, we are waiting on one more person, but I want to welcome you to our first official meeting of the year of the Appropriations, Transportation, Environment Subcommittee. And we're not live yet, so I just wanted to tell you a couple of housekeeping things. One, at the end of the session, will you come up, at the end of today's hearing, will you come up and grab our schedule from me, and we will look together at the next week's briefings, and we'll decide who is going to tackle what subjects everybody's going to read everything, but everyone to the House Appropriations, Transportation and Environment Subcommittee. This is a briefing that we have requested this year on environmental funds. And this is important because a lot of times our funds are tapped for things perhaps that are outside of the environmental issues, and we want to be sure that we understand where the funds are coming from, what they're supposed to be used for, and how they interact with other funds in the environmental area. So this is one of our most vexing challenges last year. So we are very excited to have Andrew Gray with us, who's going to take us through this very good document that he put together, which I would recommend that people maybe who might be watching or are interested in environmental funding, you can read this document. It gives you a lot of information. And with that, we will turn it over to Mr. Gray. Thank you for being here.
We'll now talk about environmental funding sources, one that's very dear to my heart here. So the outline of our presentation today.
And before you begin, I would like to ask members, I think it's okay if you want to ask a question during the presentation. We're not going to wait till the end because I think it's more relevant when you have it in your head. So just, raise your hand or put your blinker on. Go ahead.
Excellent. So in terms of the outline, we're talking about the operating versus capital budget, just kind of a big picture look there, the fund types, the major environmental special fund sources, and then we'll actually jump into the individual fund sources, which are really families, if you think about it, because it's a major fund that provides for funding for a lot of different programs in a lot of cases. So in terms of your operating versus your capital budget, so you guys are an operating committee. You're looking at the operating budget for transportation and environment issues, 1-year funding. So the budget only lasts 1 year. So any committee narrative also only lasts, in a sense, for that 1 year as well in the Joint Chairman's report. It's 1-year use funding. So it's money for salaries and that sort of thing. You're not going over that 1 year. In terms of the funding used, it's cash, general funds, special funds, federal funds, and reimbursable funds for the agencies, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. And once again, it's the funding is available for just 1 year. And in terms of the capital side of things, there's 2 components to the capital budget. You have your pay-as-you-go component. So that's capital-oriented funding, but it's actually in the operating budget. A little confusing, but it's 1-year funding, but multiple-year use. It's all but reimbursable funds are used for that purpose from what's noted above. And the funding is canceled if it's not encumbered within 7 years of appropriation. So it's in the operating budget, but it does have that tail in terms of the time period in which it can be used. The capital budget, the general obligation bond budget.
Let me interrupt you a second. All but reimbursable funds from above. Can you explain that sentence?
General funds, special funds, and federal funds are used for PAYGO purposes, but not reimbursable funds.
The definition of which is?
On the next page. The capital budget is a multi-year funding plan, so you have deauthorizations of prior year authorizations in there. You've got the current year authorizations, and you also have pre-authorizations of plans for the future as well. Operating budget doesn't do that. It only sticks to the 1 year. The capital budget does have that more kind of expansive look, and you have the capital improvement program, which the Department of Budget and Management puts out, that then shows you a 5-year plan of what they intend to do over the next couple of years. And that's also different from what you're going to see in the operating budget. Except for the Transportation Trust Fund, they do have actually kind of a longer period look in that particular area. General obligation bond funds, GO bonds, are used for that purpose. So those are general obligation bonds of the state of Maryland. So it's a full faith and credit of the state of Maryland supports those bonds, funded on a cash basis though. So when you see a project funded with bonds, it's not literally getting that funding. It's in the queue for then being able to use the authorizations cash that come out from the state's issuance of bonds every year. So it's just sort of on a cash basis. When the project needs money, it'll get it from the authorization, the overall authorization the treasurer does for cash purposes. And once again, like the PAYGO funding, if the funding is canceled, if it's not encumbered within 7 years of authorization. So it does have that tail. All right. Now going on to the fund types, Madam Chair, you asked about reimbursable funds, just a little bit down the page here. So the general funds, these are the general tax revenues, the sales and use tax, income tax, corporate income tax. These are the major revenue sources for the state of Maryland. It's the general fund's also called the good fund. This is the area that a lot of programs would like to have their money coming from because it means that they're not kind of pigeonholed into a particular funding source. It's the general funding sources of the state of Maryland. The special funds are the fees funded by the fees authorized by legislation or regulation for project-specific work. So this is a lot of places where people have very specific interests in what they want something to have happen. So there's a fee that's charged for that particular purpose that goes into the fund, and then the money is used for that particular purpose. One of the challenges that you, Madam Chair, you talked about is the idea of using money that's specified for one particular fund for other purposes. And one of the ideas out there is the idea of a nexus. Is there a connection between the new use that's being proposed and the kind of current use that's actually specified in the statute? And one of the things that happens every year, if we're in a situation like we are now with kind of fiscal needs, there's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act which can change all the rules. So the budget usually is constrained by statute, but then a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act then allows for the administration to change the rules in terms of mandates, in terms of transfers to the general fund and other provisions. And that's something that you guys then are able to take advantage of to also help balance the state's budget. And it's interesting because there's a lot of interplay between the budget committees and the policy committees because it's very policy oriented. It's when you guys are not just passing an overall policy act, the budget, you're then going in and potentially changing policy for particular programs. So just to keep that in consideration. Federal funds, allocations from a particular federal agency, that can also be funding that goes directly to recipients. You may not see it in the state budget, but it's still there. And that's one of the complex parts about all this, that there's more happening outside of the state budget than we're actually showing you guys. And that's important because that's local governments, that's individuals receiving funding, but it's not necessarily kind of showing you the true whole picture then to understand what's happening with the funding. And it may be spent over several years and may require a match sometimes. There's a match requirement potentially. Reimbursable funds, Madam Chair, so that's the agreement between agencies. And the basic idea here is we don't want to double count funding. If one agency has the money and they have a memorandum of understanding with another agency to actually use that money, we don't want to count it in both places because that artificially inflates the budget. So what we have is something called reimbursable funds. One agency actually has the funding, special funds or federal funds. The receiving agency has the reimbursable funds. So you can cut those out when you look at the big picture in order to not double count, but then when you look at a particular agency, you can then include the reimbursable funds to get a true picture of what they're going to actually be able to do and the funding sources available to them. So that's really kind of an accounting practice, if you will, in order to help make sure we're not double counting. General obligation bonds, these are taxable and non-taxable debt issuances by the treasurer that fund capital projects, and those are typically defined as projects over $100,000 value and greater than or equal to 15-year lifespan, and once again, it's a cash flow basis. And there is that taxable versus non-taxable component there. The non-taxable is if there's no private use activity, and the taxable bonds are when we actually suspect that there could be some private activity, and therefore we use the taxable bonds in order to stay on the right side of the IRS and the federal government. All right. Now, in terms of the main environmental special fund sources, these are families, once again. I'm talking about kind of 4 major families. The Bay Restoration Fund, or it's also been called the flush tax. This is funding that provides for the wastewater treatment plant upgrades and operations and maintenance grants. So local governments receive funding for enhanced nutrient removal upgrades of their wastewater treatment plants, but they're also receiving money for those plants that have actually done the upgrades for operation and maintenance purposes as well, in order to help them over the time periods with that additional cost that comes with that upgrade. Then you also have septic system upgrades, the cover crop program, and the Clean Water Commerce Act as well, that are all funded from the Bay Restoration Fund. We'll dig in more into that. That's just the big picture. Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay's 2010 Trust Fund, or it's also called the 2010 Trust Fund. It's a little anachronistic. We're in 2026 now, but this is what it is. The competitive natural filters is the major component, and I'll show you kind of what the big breakdown is for all of this. That's the major funding that comes out of the program. You also have funding there that's going to the cover crop program. So these are the 2 main sources for the cover crop program. The Bay Restoration Fund on one side, this is kind of users of wastewater treatment plants and septic system users. Then you also have the funding that comes through the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay's 2010 Trust Fund for the cover crop program. So it's got 2 sources of funding that are coming to it. And interestingly, the Bay Restoration Fund component for the cover crop program is actually money that goes directly to the Maryland Department of Agriculture. The Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay's 2010 Trust Fund is reimbursable funds coming over because it's actually, in a sense, owned by the Department of Natural Resources. Agriculture has an MOU to receive funding for that particular purpose. And you also have the administration component of the 2010 Trust Fund. The other big fund, this is going to be very, very important this year, and this is not actually in my particular budgets. Another analyst does cover this, but the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, or SEIF, provides for a lot of important programs already, which are being expanded substantially in order to help out with the state's fiscal situation. The programs are noted here. We'll talk a little bit more about those in particular later. Program Open Space, also called POS, or when somebody talks about the transfer tax, this is what we're talking about here. So it's a bunch of different programs that all provide for land preservation purposes, for capital development, and some expanded uses, which we'll talk about in a second. So now we're going to dig in. The Bay Restoration Fund, 2 agencies, Maryland Department of the Environment, Maryland Department of Agriculture. The revenues are the users of drinking water, wastewater infrastructure, and also septic systems. So it's about $60 per year. Right now, it's going to sunset in 2030, at the end of fiscal 2030. So that will mean that the fund will go back down to revenues of $30 per year per person generally, or per household. And then the commercial sector pays by volume of water use.
Would you mind telling us roughly when this started? What was the inception?
2004 or so.
Okay.
This was.
And this is what we also call the flush tax?
That's correct, yeah. So this was the funding to fund the 66, then became 67 major wastewater treatment plants. And the idea was one of the ways to get at our Bay Restoration goals, Chesapeake Bay Restoration goals, was to reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus loads that are coming from our wastewater treatment plants. They're point sources. So it's a really easy way to make sure that you're getting reductions of the nutrients that were harming the bay. So by upgrading those major wastewater treatment plants, we were able to reduce a substantial amount of nitrogen and phosphorus going into the bay. And we're actually really able to get as far as we have with our Chesapeake Bay restoration work because of that point source reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus through the funding that the state provided through everybody paying that $60 per year in terms of their household. So that's very important for Chesapeake Bay restoration purposes. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about some of the other uses that have come up over time as well. The policy uses noted there at the bottom of page 7, The operating budget, once again, for wastewater treatment plant operation and maintenance grants, and expanded to the Clean Water Commerce Act. So still within the family of environmental purposes is still the nexus, the environmental nexus, but it was an expansion of the use of the funds for the Clean Water Commerce Act. So that was buying cost-effective nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions. So the idea there was really trying to get at that idea of making sure that we can effectively do the reductions by making sure that the least cost to the state, by buying the most effective pounds per dollar reduction. Then you have the PAYGO capital budget. So originally the wastewater treatment plant upgrades, the 67 majors, that's the wastewater account. The other account within the Bay Restoration Fund is the septic systems and upgrades and MDA's cover crop program, which is called the septic account. So two main accounts, the wastewater account for the wastewater treatment plants, and the septic account covers both cover crop program and also septic system upgrades. So the idea sort of was you had the wastewater account for the point sources. These are people are paying in because they're on public water, public sewer. Then you have the septic side of things is more dispersed, more rural aspect of things. And so that was more septic system users, well users, were paying in for then helping with the cover crop program and septic system upgrades. Then there's been expansion of the wastewater account substantially over the years to other water quality infrastructure improvements in terms of combined sewer overflows, in terms of stormwater infrastructure, in terms of connecting septic systems to wastewater treatment plants and so forth. In terms of the budgetary uses, so this is code word for not using it necessarily for the original intended purpose. Transfers to the general fund in fiscal 2010 through fiscal 2012 during a fiscal time period of fiscal need. That was all repaid with general obligation bonds through fiscal 2013. Now there's a transfer to the general fund again in fiscal 2027, so it's around 15 years after the last transfer. It's $70 million, and it's repaid with general obligation bonds over 2 years, $50 million in fiscal 2027 and $20 million in fiscal 2028. So the funding is being transferred, but being replaced by general obligation bonds, the full amount.
Question. This is over 2 years, and in the previous time that this has been done, was it over 2 years or 1 year?
Well, it was actually over 3 years.
3 years, okay. So I guess the bottom line is my question is, can the state renege on those out years?
Renege on paying it back?
Yes.
You can do whatever you want. I mean, you could cut that money this year. You don't have to have that money. This year, the money is going to provide for particular projects. I'm sorry. So that's the trick. You're getting the money to the general fund, but then if you want the projects to actually happen, you have to have the general obligation bonds to pay for them.
So this year, the $50 million has to be, I mean, it is currently part of our budget, the $50 million GO bonds, but next year, there should be another $20 million.
You don't have to pay it back if you don't want to.
No, I'm just trying to figure out what the requirement is. And so the state can decide, oh, we can't afford that $20 million and we're not going to pay it back this year.
Yes. The Bay Restoration Fund originally did not have enough revenue coming in for the time period in which we wanted to do all the work, so revenue bonds were issued. Those revenue bonds require debt service payments. The debt service payments will continue until the end of the time period in which the funding, the $60 per year. So the rating agencies will have something to say about this. They did the last time, and they've had concerns between that time period when we transferred and now, due to some of the fluctuations that we saw during the pandemic, where it looked like there might have been some transitions from commercial users to people being at home, and people being at home were already paying, but if you weren't getting the water use of the corporate side, then you were seeing reduced revenues to the Bay Restoration Fund. So the rating agencies will not be excited by this. They will at least be kind of somewhat satisfied that it's being repaid back, but you guys aren't issuing any more bonds between now and 2030 because there's not enough time. So with the rating agencies' consideration of the revenue bonds is not as important, perhaps, one could say. If you're going to try to issue bonds after 2030, then certainly that would be a potential consideration.
Okay, keep going.
I think we had a couple of questions.
Sorry, I didn't see the questions.
Two things has got my attention again, is the sunsets, we talked about that a little bit yesterday, and the wastewater treatment. Question, as I talk, our voters don't want us to keep coming back for money on the sunsets. Is there any way we can just eliminate the sunsets and just say that money is going to be there until? Does that make sense?
So the sunset currently means it'll go from $60 per year to $30 per year. Are you saying that people want to continue the $60 per year?
No. What I'm saying is the sunset, if it stops, we have to come back here and discuss it again.
No, it's just done.
Oh, it's, okay.
Yeah, 60 to 30 just happens. Unless you do something, it defaults to going down to 30.
Okay, so after the sunset this time, it's just continue.
At $30 per year
Okay.
per household in general, yes.
Okay, I'm clear now.
Delegate Nielsen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to get a sense of how we came up with the 50 and the 20 breakdown. Are there projects in the wastewater treatment fund and the septic fund for which there's 50 million allocated for FY27?
That is my understanding. I need to explore that further in the analysis to really dig into
Sure.
that, but certainly there is a tremendous amount of need out there. So the minor wastewater treatment plants are now in the queue to receive funding, which is the second most important after the majors. And there's all sorts of other infrastructure improvements that the state requires. But I will dig into that more for the MDE PAYGO analysis.
Great, thank you.
Delegate Harrison.
Just for clarification, I'm going back to the $30 and the $30 and $60. So it went up to $60 to help to mitigate the problems that we were seeing, and then going back down to the 30 is for maintenance.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, the idea was we were going to finish everything by 2025. All the major wastewater treatment plants are going to be completed. And then originally the sense was, okay, you'd finished your work. Well, with any fee in place and any funding available for environmental purposes, there's always a consideration of, well, what else can we use this for? More people get interested in finding ways to use that money for their particular purposes, and then it's more difficult to necessarily change that, that flow. But right, so originally the idea was we wanted to get as much work done as we could on the wastewater treatment plants as fast as we could by 2025. So we issued the debt, the revenue bonds, and we increased the fee. But then after all that work was done, in theory, you then sunset the fee to the $30 level again. So it's gone from 2012, it went up to 60, then in 2030, it'll go back down to 30.
Yeah, I'm really just talking about the $30 because at some point, there's going to have to be more work done.
Right.
And just to mitigate any other problems. So you already have basically a fund that is built in to make sure that we can continue to keep the bay clean, keep the nutrients, the bad nutrients down out of it. And so that way we don't have to come back and ask for another upgrade, basically. That would be the purpose of the $30 fee.
That would be the purpose for keeping it at the 60.
At the third.
Well, if you want, it goes from 60 to 30.
Right.
30 will continue onwards. If you
Right.
want to do a lot more work, you'd probably want to leave it at the $60 level.
Well, I would just say, I think your interpretation is correct. And the discussion will be whether we keep it at 30 or keep it at 60, or raise it to 30, keep it at 60,
So
before 2030.
Right, so the MDE, at the bottom of that page, MDE has proposed, at least in the Bay Restoration Fund Advisory Committee meeting, that if the fee were maintained at the $60 level, then they would have the wastewater treatment plants funding, they'd provide funding to bring the wastewater treatment plants down to 2.8 milligrams per liter nitrogen instead of 3 milligrams per liter. And then when you're talking about lots of gallons of water coming through, that can be very important.
Right.
Just one other thing to clarify there, or just to kind of point out the balance, $160 million in cash balance as of October 2025. remember there's a cash balance, which is sort of like, what's all the money in there? But there might be uses for it already. That money might be already encumbered for other purposes, which it doesn't reflect the actual money available.
Got it.
All right, so the Chesapeake and Atlantic
Wait,
Coastal.
before you go on, any more questions on the Bay Restoration Fund? All righty.
All right, Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays 2010 Trust Fund. So this is your second major kind of special fund family of a sort. So the Department of Natural Resources, kind of the main receiver of funding there. Maryland Department of the Environment's also part of it. Maryland Department of Agriculture, University of Maryland, and the Department of Information Technology. So a bunch of different users of this funding. The revenues are the short-term rental vehicle users tax and the gas tax. So what you're actually seeing here is the environment purposes are connecting with another family of funding, which is the transportation trust funds. So one could argue that the transportation trust fund is being used for environmental purposes, but then obviously people drive to parks and there are other implications where the gas tax would kind of make sense for this particular purpose.
If I might ask, was this always the source of the 2010 trust fund, or was there ever a different source or a different source originally proposed?
Originally proposed was an impervious surface fee. So the idea was that you would have kind of an incentive to reduce the amount of area you're developing because you'd have to pay more based on the kind of per square foot of impervious surface area you are creating. The impervious surface is really kind of one of the major considerations for Chesapeake Bay restoration purpose, environmental purpose in general. So the impervious surface fee, which was called the rain tax, was the original conception. That did not actually come out in the final legislation, and instead there was a sort of compromise to go with these particular fund sources instead.
So essentially, they pushed the rain tax down to the counties for a different use.
In terms of the like stormwater work that's
Yeah.
being done,
Or was that completely unrelated?
it is some. I think that you're right. I think it is connected. Like you're
Yeah.
testing my memory here.
Do
That
you,
was a
I
couple of
think
years
Delegate
ago.
Harrison, do you remember that? Yeah. So the nexus between short-term rental vehicle user tax and the gas tax is really basically our roads and the runoff on our roads contribute to these environmental issues. Therefore, the nexus is these two vehicle taxes create pollution, so we're going to use those to help reduce it.
Certainly, there's the nitrogen coming off of the car exhaust will go into the bay.
Even the
so
runoff of the impervious surface.
Well, the impervious surfaces too,
Yeah,
yeah. But,
right.
but in terms of the gas tax money, yeah, the impervious surface in terms of the roads, and then, yeah, in terms of the nitrogen coming out of the cars and then deposited into the bay. Deposition, you also have that as well.
Got it.
Then in terms of policy uses, originally you were looking at non-point source pollution reduction projects. So this is really kind of Department of Natural Resources focused. They really did feel sort of PAYGO related, sort of capital projects, but they were never funded as such. They're always in the operating budget, just as a straight operating appropriation. Over time, the funding has been expanded to include the cover crop program. So that obviously helped us in terms of the general fund expenditures for that particular purpose. Soil Conservation District salaries, that helps make sure that we have the personnel out there to help work with the farmers to make sure that they're getting the best practices on their land for their business and also for the bay. It's also the funding for the Tree Solutions Now Act in terms of trying to get to that 5 million trees by 2030, I think it is. And the whole Watershed Act fund, which is kind of the most recent major addition, the idea of choosing the 5 different watersheds and then finding different state funding sources to then kind of really make sure that those watersheds are kind of shepherded through the process to getting to where we want to go for Chesapeake Bay restoration purposes.
Delegate Eagleson.
Thank you. So I might be jumping ahead again to like a future budget analysis, but since part of the revenue that fills the 2010 trust fund is the gas tax, and we've seen a decline in gas tax revenues recently, do we have any concerns that the portion of gas taxes that fill this account will be insufficient for our needs?
Well, that's definitely a long-term concern. Yeah, we're seeing decline in terms of the balance that they have available for projects. So they had a fairly healthy balance, and we'll be talking about that in a second, how that's being spent, which is what you're supposed to do. But then at some point, you'll then potentially have to reduce the amount of work you're able to do because the revenues are not coming in.
Got it. Thank you.
Would you define non-point source pollution reduction projects? Give us an example.
So wastewater treatment plants are your classic point source is a pipe that actually comes out into a water body. So you actually can put a meter on that, you can actually measure it, you can permit it. Non-point source pollution is more your landscape style pollution. So that's, in some senses, stormwater, if you don't have a kind of a stormwater infrastructure that can focus the water, or agricultural lands, or just kind of rural lands in general, where there's, at this point, we don't have a concrete way of making sure we know how much is coming off the land and then saying, we want to permit this.
Great, thanks.
Then in terms of the PAYGO capital fund, some uses function as capital or not budgeted as such. Continuing on the budgetary uses, the transfers to the general fund have occurred, and there's defrays up to $2.5 million per year for Tree Solutions Now Act, so that's saved some general funds. There's also $10.5 million in operating expenses per year were authorized beginning in fiscal 2026. The administration is taking advantage of that.
Operating expenses for what?
For the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays 2010 Trust Fund and other purposes within DNR, which have a nexus to the program, but that due to the state's fiscal situation, it was easier to kind of do this.
We're using this to help fund DNR?
Correct.
The operating expenses of DNR?
It's defraying the use of general funds.
Gotcha.
Otherwise, we'd have to put general funds in there, which are in short supply. The balance is decreasing from around $48.2 million at the end of fiscal 2025, $23.2 million to $11.2 million estimated at the end of fiscal 2027. Once again, that's because we're doing a lot more than we have funding for, but we have a balance right now to kind of pay for that, and that's where Delegate Edelson's point becomes poignant looking forward. In terms of the comments, we already discussed the impervious surface fee as the original intent of the legislation, but it was not passed with that provision. Then here's the 2010 Trust Fund kind of breakdown for fiscal 2025 through 2027. So you see the starting balances there at the very top. So this is a kind of starting balance. What's your revenue? How do you use it? What's your final balance for each particular year? And you can see all the different uses and their categories of use on the left-hand side. The agencies sort of in the middle, and then the amount of funding per year. Not much change at this particular part of the funding between year to year. If you look a little bit further down here, at the bottom of the page where it says Competitive Grant Program DNR, you look all the way to the right, to $12.7 million decrease. And that's acknowledging that if we want to do things like support our operating budget with the 2010 Trust Fund and all the other purposes we have, then we need to cut back somewhere. So it was a reduction of the Competitive Grant Program non-point source pollution reduction projects, which then allows us to continue to use the fund for defraying some of our operating needs. And then if you look on this final page here, you see the total amount of funding being used for those particular purposes year to year. Strategic Energy Investment Fund, this is SEEF.
Before you go on, are there any questions on the 2010 Trust Fund? Fine, thank you.
So the next major family is Strategic Energy Investment Funds. So this is, I think it was back in 2008 or so. The fund was passed. The fund revenues come from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, sort of the Northeast kind of states, kind of got together, Middle Atlantic states, got together to create this, this initiative to have an auction of carbon dioxide allowances, sort of being proposed in other areas and also looked at as potentially at some point maybe kind of a federal plan of some kind. But at this point, this is one of the strongest kind of regional carbon dioxide allowance auctions around. There's also the funding that comes in through Renewable Portfolio Standard Alternative Compliance Payments. So this is our various tiers in terms of the waste utilities need to actually create certain types of energy. And if they're not able to, or they're not going to do that, then they'll pay into the alternative compliance payments, part of the SEEF fund. Number of agencies are now taking advantage of it. So Maryland Energy Administration on down here. This is, it's an impressive kind of rogues gallery here. Then in terms on page 15, you have your policy uses. So it's originally the kind of clean energy programs through the Maryland Energy Administration, climate programs through MDE, bill assistance through the Department of Human Services, and then low and moderate income housing retrofits through DHCD. were kind of your original kind of, and state building energy conservation through Department of General Services. That was sort of your kind of original plan. And the original conception was, let's try to reduce the amount of energy we need to use and incentivize the use of, or development of renewable energy. But over time, we've seen the need to defray some of our other costs. One of those major ones early on was the bill assistance rate relief. The idea was, people are actually paying for energy because maybe their houses aren't necessarily the most efficient in terms of insulation and so forth. So it made sense. There was a nexus there. But then, that cuts into the money that would make it available to then pay for long-term retrofits to those housings. If you're paying bill assistance year to year, that's not money you're paying in for retrofits that are going to have multi-year benefits. But then there's been expansion over time. Maryland Clean Energy Center receives funding. The state fleet chargers receive funding as well, support for higher education. Maryland Department of the Environment is now receiving more operating cost money, more than was originally provided just for climate programs and for Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative dues. You also have the Power Plant Research Program, which is a new addition in the Department of Natural Resources. There is a nexus there, of course. Power Plant Research Program does evaluate new power generation sources for the environmental impacts, but it's obviously an expansion. Resiliency efforts through the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, grid enhancement through the Public Service Commission, and transmission infrastructure through MDOT as well. In terms of the PAYGO capital budget, there's several uses that are new for SEEF in fiscal 2027, facilities renewal, comprehensive flood management program, and MDE, and also higher education projects. In terms of the budgetary uses, transfers to the general funds have occurred and defrays operating expenses throughout the budget. Defraying of the operating expenses throughout the budget occurred in fiscal 2026 and 2027. This is a large component of the balancing plan for fiscal 2027. The estimated fiscal 2027 end-of-year balance is $163.9 million, but once again, remember, there's always the concern about whether there are any encumbrances there. And then in terms of how this particular fund is set up, it's an interesting one where the money is allocated on the statutory side in terms of how the money goes into the fund. So it says you have to put the money into these particular accounts for these particular purposes, but then there is no requirement to pay out of those particular accounts on any schedule. So when we talk about the transfer tax in a second, it's the flip of that. The transfer tax actually requires that you pay out in particular ways. For the SEEF, it actually, requirement is to how you pay into it. And then there's the auction revenues, and alternative compliance payments have increased substantially over time, which is why it's now very much in interest for helping balancing our budget.
What was the year of origin of this fund?
I believe it was around fiscal 2008.
2003?
Excuse me.
2008.
And I can confirm that with you later if it's not true.
Yeah,
It was
please.
around that time period.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know this is probably a difficult one to answer right now. I feel like I keep doing that. But is there any way for us to have a sense on for how long we should expect these significantly heightened ACP revenues and Reggie auction revenues to be coming into our various SEEF accounts?
That's a very good question. I think it sort of depends on legislation in terms of also how the Reggie how it's set up. The cap is periodically evaluated and lowered, which means that there's a potential for more revenue to come in just because you have to pay more for those allowances.
Right.
But it's in terms of a long-term budget solving plan, I think, which is sort of your underlying point, it is not a long-term budget solving plan.
Yeah.
Is there a projection of the revenues over the next however many years?
I will defer to our analysts in the agency on that, but I'll tell our analysts to look into that in terms of the revenues for both SEEF and also the alternative compliance.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Delegate Spiegel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a related question to those two questions, which is just to clarify on this slide, when we say that the estimated fiscal 27 end-of-year balance is about $164 million, that's after the significant proposed transfers in the administration's proposed budget to the general fund, correct?
That's my understanding, yes. But then once again, some of that money could be encumbered, so it's
Some
not
potential
necessarily
encumbrances.
free and clear.
Yeah.
And then as Delegate Edelson's pointed out, it's not going to last forever or so,
Right.
obviously. And then there's always the policy issues of, do you want to try to do more of the climate change work as well?
Understood. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, keep
And
going.
here's the breakdown as provided by the Department of Budget and Management in the Governor's Budget Highlights book in terms of how the funding is being used for fiscal 25 through fiscal 2027. There are a lot of puts and takes in Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act provisions. So I will defer to our analysts to kind of get into the nitty-gritty details. This is sort of the big picture look, the kind of the governor's plan. And then moving on to the next page, the big picture appropriations. And you see there's quite a bit more being appropriated as you move from fiscal 2025 through fiscal 2027, which is most likely not sustainable. In terms of the alternative compliance payments, so you have the RGGI revenues, you have also this alternative compliance payment expenditures. We just pointed out here that there's around $312 million in fiscal 2027 is planned for this particular purpose. Some of it is proposed in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. It does reflect, though, an $86 million difference between the 2 years, fiscal 2026 and fiscal 2027.
And there, I thought there was a list in here of the expanded uses for 2027, is there?
For CEF, so we did discuss that a little bit up here.
Yeah, okay.
On page 15.
Okay. I think the list is in the actual budget, if anyone's interested. It was quite a few things.
Right, if you just look at the number of agencies involved now.
Right, like IT.
It's, unfortunately, in difficult budget years, you look for some of the easiest ways to kind of address your
Right.
problems, even though it's not necessarily long-term.
Understood.
So
All
that-
right. Any questions on CEF, the CEF fund? All right, we can go on to program open space.
Okay, so this is the final large family environmental funding sources we'll talk about here. Once again, it's the transfer tax, POS.
Year of origin?
1970 or so, it was called the Outdoor Recreation Land Loan, way back when. And a former appropriations chairman actually kind of pointed out the original kind of proclamation on the wall when we recommended some cuts to the program. So that was very telling in terms of his interest in kind of maintaining that heritage of we're using this fund for land preservation and conservation purposes way back. And interestingly, it has been used for on a kind of financing basis as well. So it was originally it's a land loan, but back in 2010 or so, it was the idea of actually using the revenues to securitize revenues in a sense. So issue debt using the transfer tax to repay it. And we're just repaying that final portion of the debt this year in fiscal 2026. And then it'll be free and clear. But that is a possibility in the future. You could issue, in a sense, more bonds that would be kind of paid back by the transfer tax over time if that's of interest. Originally, it was done due to the concern that there was a fiscal difficulties and that we were also seeing a transfer of wealth from one generation to another in terms of, so the idea was let's make sure we have enough money to pay for the properties that will then kind of be a heritage for the state of Maryland going forward and not worry about the fact that we don't have as much money as we need to at that point for that purpose. In terms of the agencies that are involved, the Department of Natural Resources, the main one here, Department of Planning receives some money as well for the heritage areas and also for Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. Operating expenses in fiscal 2027 and onwards. It's a new addition to the program open space complements. You also have the Maryland Department of Agriculture and the Department of General Services. So that's the 0.5% consideration for the transfer of real property, state transfer tax. It's always very interesting to find out what the new revenue estimates are going to be for the transfer tax. Nobody ever hits it. It's always, we seem to sort of rebase. We always sort of think we're going to kind of retain or get more money from the transfer tax than we do, and then we have to rebase, then we sort of grow it from that particular base. And unfortunately, that has some impacts for our projects. When you have an underattainment of revenue for a particular year, that means that you have to true up a future budget. Because we actually budget this year for the money that we think we're going to get. We won't know that until the end of the fiscal year. So if we don't get that amount, then we're going to have to true up. So if we get less, then we have to reduce the amount that we're going to provide for purposes in the future. And if we get more, then we actually can enhance the amount, the appropriation we provide for a future year. So we're hopefully more trued up now, so we won't see as many of those reductions from prior years. So originally, land acquisition and capital project oversight were kind of main components. Expanded to the Maryland Park Service and Forest Service in the recession that occurred around the Great Recession around 2007, 2008. The idea was there was a nexus. Let's expand the use of the transfer tax for operating expenses, which is, it made sense at the time. It was a way to defray general funds in a very difficult time period. But over time, we've seen the difficulty it's caused because with the fluctuations of the transfer tax, you're seeing fluctuations in operating revenues, which are ongoing. PAYGO revenues you can cut back. You can decide, okay, we're just not going to do as much this year. But operating revenues are paying for salaries and for work that's going to be done in that particular year. So it's having a fluctuating revenue source is difficult. But we haven't taken the Park Service and the Forest Service off of that because we haven't found a viable alternative funding source to kind of maintain their work. Then once again, it's also the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority received $3 million, and it's now upgraded to $6 million. And the Jefferson Patterson Park Museum will also be receiving funding going forward under the governor's plan. PAYGO capital budget side of things, so this is originally program open space, kind of the program open space state and local components, so the state government and the local governments as well receiving funding. Rural Legacy Program, Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Program, so all kind of within that compass of environmental, like land conservation, easement purposes. But then it was expanded to the Program Open Space Green Space Equity Program more recently to kind of provide for more equity in terms of how that money was used in kind of more urbanized areas, and then also for public access purposes. So it really was available for public access, but it was never broken out separately. So we're kind of reflecting that here as sort of now the administration is showing it's breaking out separately. It's sort of, in a sense, it's an expanded use because it's become more transparent in terms of how that funding is being used. In terms of the budgetary uses, this is one of the major ways that the state has used a fund to help balance the state budget. So back between something like 2002 and 2018, there was approximately $1 billion was transferred to the general fund, and then approximately $700 million was repaid over that time period. So not all of it was repaid, a substantial amount was, and that was a major consideration because obviously things didn't get tremendously better with the economy, so therefore every repayment was in theory sort of saying, well, we weren't quite ready to do this. But so they did do the repayments. It's also been used to defray the Maryland Park Service operating expenses, currently allocating $25 million per year to the general fund through fiscal 2029, and it will replace $71.9 million, which is being transferred to the general fund in fiscal 2027 with general obligation bonds in fiscal 2027. So that's just a one-for-one swap that's going to occur in fiscal 2027. So you're balancing your operating budget in a sense by using your capital budget.
A question on this. So the $25 million per year was through fiscal 2029. That started last year.
Correct.
There is no plan to pay that back.
That's the legislation says that there's no repayment requirement. And that made sense because we're trying to maintain the fiscal condition of the state to commit to a repayment would have been challenging.
But the $71.9 million this year that they are taking is going to be replaced with bonds.
With general obligation bonds in fiscal 2027 is programmed for that purpose.
Thank you. Any other questions on that?
Then in terms of the balance, there's about $120 million cash balance as of September 2025. We'll update this for the DNR PAYGO analysis. That's $120 million or so for state and the locals have their own balance. Once again, a substantial amount of that is encumbered. Some portion of that is encumbered, so it's not a complete available balance for that purpose. And the administration is using the balance per legislation last year that authorized them to use the balance as long as it stays above $80 million for operating expenses within DNR. So program open space is being used to help balance the budget in a couple of different ways in fiscal 2027.
Delegate Spiegel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I saw in the budget books this week something like POS local funds set at about $50 million, which is an increase of $25 million, I guess, over last year. And I just want to kind of understand how that compares historically to prior years, because it's listed as an increase of 25 million, but of course last year we had kind of exceptional circumstances, and to have an understanding of what the proposed budget offers in terms of POS state and local funding directly.
So the proposed budget, it's based on the formula, which is on the next page. If you want me to I can talk a little bit more about how that works.
Sure, yeah, and I know that the formula was listed as an example. I wasn't sure if that was just sort of
that's the
theoretical
one.
or the actual reflection of the current proposed budget.
That's my understanding of the fiscal 2027 budget.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we can kind of explore that. But the formula dictates everything. So it's your estimate of your future revenue coming in for that fiscal year, and then it's any kind of prior year adjustments that occur. And then everything just flows basically according to that formula. So if you have a tremendous increase in the transfer tax revenue estimate, then a substantial increase in the funding that will go to the locals. One of the big considerations between fiscal 2026 and fiscal 2027 is that the fiscal 2026 revenue estimate, which was impacted by fiscal 2024, so the fiscal 2024 revenue estimate was rosier than we actually received, and therefore you had to balance that in fiscal 2026 by reducing substantially. In fiscal 2027, we had a better estimate for fiscal 2025, so we're not reducing as much of that revenue coming in, and therefore you're seeing an increase between the 2 years for that reason primarily, although there is some increase in the revenue estimate as well.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
So I just want to make sure I understand. I know you just referenced it, but I didn't fully understand the explanation on the final sentence on the budgetary uses, if that's the same concept or two separate concepts, meaning in the budget bill of a year ago, we allocated 25 million per year from this fund to the general fund through fiscal 29 with no specific plan to replace that funding set out in law. Then it says, and we'll replace 71.9 million with GO bonds in fiscal 27. So
that could have been made more clear. So $71.9 million in special funds goes to the general fund.
Okay.
$71.9 million in general obligation bonds then fills in that hole.
It's two different things.
Right.
Two different things,
So
correct.
it's 25
That's not getting repaid.
each year. And then in 27, it's an additional 71.9, but that 71.9 is being replaced with GO bond.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Okay, that is helpful.
And then we also talked a little bit about how the formula works in terms of the funding is allocated out by statute instead of how it goes into it. All right, so here's the transfer tax formula. This is the last two slides of the presentation. This is kind of how it works. The transfer tax revenues as a whole are the revenue estimate for a particular year. So $245.4 million for fiscal 2027. So then you take out 3% for administration purposes on the far left, 7.4 million, leaving $238 million to then be allocated. So this is a filter, if you will, as you go down. Then you have an adjustment for prior year over or under attainment. So in fiscal 2025, we are a rosier estimate than we actually received in actual revenues. So we had to reduce $12.6 million. So $225.4 million now available. That takes you to the 100% allocation to programs. This is where we've shown the $25 million allocation to the general fund for fiscal 2027. And the breakdown, $7.4 million for POS State, Rural Legacy $5.9 million, and MALF $11.7 million. And that's proportional to the amount of money they're expected to receive. That leaves you then with the $200.4 million, which is then allocated for that second to the bottom there is to land acquisition. There's a 1% additional amount that goes to land acquisitions, 1.8% that goes to Heritage Conservation Fund for endangered species and threatened species land purchases. Rural Legacy is first cut at the or bite at the apple, $7.8 million here, and then there's $26.7 million for Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation. That's once again after accounting for the reduction. Then in the final line there, you see the breakdown between program open space states and other funding. And you see that up to $3 million for the Heritage Areas Authority, that goes to the Maryland Department of Planning. That's their first allocation of funding of the three of the six. And you're seeing the 74 point, it's the difference between the 2 years. There is money that's going to the general fund as well for POS state purposes. Then on the next page, you see the POS state allocation to the heritage areas. That's the next $3 million. So they get a total of $6 million for the heritage areas. This is where the money comes out. Rural legacy is authorized up to $8 million, but the administration is only providing $5.6 million for that particular purpose. Some of that money is being transferred to the general fund. Capital development receives an allocation as well, $19.9 million for purposes such as natural resource development fund, new things on state land, on state parks, for critical maintenance or fixing things that need to be fixed in our state parks, and finally for Ocean City beach maintenance. And then you have the other allocations noted at the bottom of the page there. I won't go into that in too much more detail. And then the final part on the far right-hand side is the 50% other, which one portion of this allocation is the POS local allocation. That's the $49.6 million. Then you have the money that goes to the Forest and Park Service. This is the $21 million, or 20% of the particular part of the formula. So that's a kind of floor that will increase as revenues increase, but once the revenues decrease, it'll just stay at 21 million, which may not be sufficient for the Park Service. Then you have that final component there is the greater than 2.2% or $200,000 for Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. That's the new addition that's in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act for fiscal 2027.
Delegate Spiegel.
Thank you, and thank you for walking us through that. I think that's a very helpful flow chart to understand where all the funds go. So going back to my previous question, particularly for POS state and POS local as reflected in the page 22 final slide, how does the total, bearing in mind that transfer tax revenues change from year to year, bearing in mind that we had an unusual year last year, how does the total amounts compare to the last several years in terms of the dollar amounts that were given to POS state and POS local?
Well, I'll compare 2004 was a banner year in terms of, 2024, excuse me, was a banner year of funding. And I have to go back and actually find the actual number, but it was substantially more than what they're receiving this year. And unfortunately then, with the decline in the revenue estimate and then the kind of underattainments that we experienced, it's come down. But I'll confirm that for the DNR PAYGO analysis. You'd like to see a POS state, POS local history allocation for couple years, 5?
5 would be great, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to include that in the presentation for
Appreciate it.
DNR PAYGO.
Delegate Spiegel?
You mean me? Or?
I mean Delegate Edelson.
I know we look similar, it's okay. So I agree, that was a very helpful breakdown. I just want to understand, in the first page of the formula breakdown, you have on the right-hand side at the bottom, the column reflecting the 25 million and the breakdown as to where that funding went. Is that the same as the 25 million that we moved in the budget bill of 2025 to general funds? So is your point that 25 million is now in general funds and that's the allocation of those general funds?
No, so that's the money that goes to the general fund from the transfer tax. So these are the programs that would have received special funds, but that money is being transferred to the general fund.
So you're deducting that and you're ending up with 200 million.
200.4 million available for allocation.
Okay, so the point there is that POS state received 7.4 million less than it would have had we not included that in the budget bill, and rural legacy received 5.9 million less than it would have. MELF received 11.7 million less than it would have.
Right, because if the money was not transferred to the general fund, it would have gone to the programs through the formula.
Okay, so it went somewhere else entirely in the general fund and not these 3 places.
Well, so they went to the general fund itself. So it's sort of like you have your small bank accounts, which are like all your special funds. Then you've got your big state bank account. It went to the big state bank account.
Right, and allocated to other places, not these 3 places where it would otherwise have been.
Correct. I mean, it goes in for the general, whatever the administration then provides general funds for in fiscal 2027.
Any other questions on Delegate Harrison?
Thank you. You mentioned the Ocean City beach restoration. Where was that? I missed when you said that.
So it's actually on page 22.
Yeah.
It's not delineated, unfortunately. Maybe I should do that. It's the $19.9 million on the left-hand side under capital development.
Okay.
It's $1 million from that amount. So that's the amount every year that's allocated from the state side, and there's $1 million from the locals, Worcester County and Ocean City, which is usually kind of, from what I understand, is the interest on the kind of the money that's gone in there. Will then provide for that $2 million in allocation of funding. And we'll talk more about this because there's definitely concerns about Ocean City Beach replenishment now that the federal government looks like it's pulled back its interest in providing for assistance in that way.
Thank you.
Any other questions on program open space? Any other questions on the presentation as a whole? I would say, Mr. Gray, that this is very helpful for me. Just beginning to look at it as 4 families of funds helps a lot, because we're always throwing these names around in the budget hearing, and you're trying to remember what's that part of what that. So this is helpful. I suggest we all keep this with us when we get into the environmental agencies. Very, very, very helpful. Any last questions? Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here and putting this presentation together. And members, if you could just come up to the desk briefly. We are adjourned.